Okay, today is... What is today? Today is November 12th and 13th, depending on what day you were in my class. But we started our brand new unit today, the Gilded Age. And we talked about what the word guild means. Now, our boy, Mark Twain, he came up with this phrase called the Gilded Age. And gilded basically means that on the outside, it looks really shiny. It looks golden. It looks pretty. But on the inside, it's hard as rock. It's lead. It doesn't look as nice. It looks ugly. It looks like trash. All right? And so, to describe this time period, America on the outside, it looked star-spanglingly awesome. Everyone wanted to move there. It was like the influencer house on TikTok. But on the inside, it doesn't look as nice. In fact, for most people, it was not very nice at all.
I just can't believe I'm really here. It feels so magical.
Our tagline for this unit is the grass greener on the other side? And just like with our other unit, we focus on sourcing with Reconstruction. For this unit, we're going to focus on, drum roll please, close reading. We're going to focus on close reading, trying to identify those little details in each source that will help us to determine the important things of the document. Now, just like with Reconstruction, how we had 3 different issues that we had to deal with, for the Gilded Age, we have 6 different issues. And for each video, we're going to focus on a different issue. For this video, we're going to focus on the Wild Wild West.
Wild Wild West.
So we got to get into our cowboy mode. Cowboy mode.
Top of the morning, you ladies.
So normally when people think of the Wild Wild West, we think of cowboys, we think of ranchers, we think of tumbleweeds, Wider, the OK Corral, the Marlboro Band. You know, we think of all these mythos of the Wild Wild West. Well, unfortunately, much of that was not exactly 100% what the West looked like. This first issue of the West has to deal with how do we connect California with the rest of the country, because that's the big issue. Our first kind of little experiment with it is the Pony Express. Now, many of you remembered what the Pony Express was. It was a relay system using horses. It was basically our first mail system to connect California with the rest of the country, but it was made obsolete for 2 different reasons. One was that the telegraph was invented, and the telegraph basically allowed you to send a message through a wire. So you didn't have to write out a letter anymore, you could just send it through a wire. Basically this, except it was a big long cord. But the telegraph couldn't send people or packages. Also, the Pony Express was very expensive, and as we talked about in the last unit, Americans do not like taxes. We hate taxes, and that's how the government pays for pretty much everything.
6. Oh my gosh.
Where's all your money gone, Daddy?
Taxes. 9, 10, 11. Let me fix my houses. But it's okay. It's part of the game. No, it's not. It is fun.
So the question was, how are we going to connect California with the rest of the country? And many of you knew it just like that. Railroads.
I like trains.
During the Civil War, Congress passed what's called the Pacific Railway Act. It subsidized. Whoa! Big word. What does subsidized mean? Well, subsidized means that the government pays a private company or individual to do the job for them. So rather than the government building the railroads, the government hired or paid the Central Pacific and Union Railroad companies to build the Transcontinental Railroad. So basically what that meant was that Central Pacific started in California, Union started in Nebraska, and they met in the middle in Promontory, Utah, where they drove a golden spike right through the middle of the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, building the railroads was a very, very dangerous job. In fact, this was one of the first kind of jobs where we began to use what's called TNT, or dynamite. Many people died through explosions or other things, and the companies, Central Pacific and Union, relied heavily on immigrant labor to build the railroads. Central Pacific relied heavily upon Chinese immigrant labor, whereas Union in Nebraska focused heavily on Irish immigrant labor. And railroads changed a lot of American society. Railroads led to more people and more animals and more everything moving out west. Steel, cattle, and mining industries such as coal grew exponentially overnight. And to make railway travel more uniform, companies invented what we now know today as time zones. Because before this, people would commonly keep time based off of how high the sun was in the sky, such as high noon, which is what many people think of when they think of the West, high noon. Now let's talk about cowboys, because a lot of you said cowboys when I asked what you thought about the Wild Wild West. After the Civil War, beef was in high demand. Everyone wanted that Travis Scott Fortnite burger, all right? Everyone wanted the beef patty.
Hello? Where is the beef?
Ranchers, who came mostly from Texas, raised a lot of cows and used the Great Plains as grazing fields, mostly ignoring Native American land boundaries, which is a pattern that you'll see in the next video. Cowboys adopted techniques and clothing from the Mexican cultural icon known as the vaquero.
We're almost there. El vaquero.
Basically where we get our modern conception of what a cowboy is. Cowboys tended to be a little unruly, so townspeople would call upon local lawmen known as vigilantes.
Get 3 coffins ready.
Huh?
And they called upon these average citizens. These were not trained police officers. These were just pretty much average citizens that were called upon to keep order in the town. And this gave rise to what's known as the mythic Wild West. And the most famous of these was Wyatt Earp at the OK Corral. The shootout at the OK Corral was made into a movie called Tombstone, and we watched a scene from that movie, the actual shootout scene in the movie, in class. And then we talked about the Homestead Act. Now this is super important. This will definitely be on your test for this unit. Homestead Act. Say it with me. Homestead Act. Homestead Act. It opened up 160 acres of land for basically $20 to any white homesteader who was willing to farm it and improve it by building a house on it for 5 years.
And that's a great price.
Eventually, it was opened up to African Americans, women, and immigrants, but most either couldn't afford it, they were kept away from it, or they just couldn't move to it. What's the catch? Sounds like a great deal, right? Well, it's out in the Great Plains where there's very little rain, meaning that unless you have heavy irrigation projects set up, you were basically trying to farm on a piece of crust, and you can't grow anything. And most people could not grow anything on their plot of land, and they ended up having to sell it either to cattle ranching or railroad companies. And then we focused on the plight of farmers, because farmers are the ones that move predominantly out west.
We are farmers. Bum, 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 bum.
During this time period, farmers begin to lose a lot more money, because not only are their shipping fees high, there's a high cost of supplies, there's also high interest. So in 1867, Oliver Hudson Kelley, he organizes the National Grange for the Patrons of Husbandry. I don't expect you to remember his name or the specific name of the grange. I just need you to remember what a grange is. And remember that a grange is a place where grain is stored. And I want us to think of it as it's basically a union for farmers. Farmers are coming together to basically help each other out in hard times. They provided social services to start with, because farmers live out in the middle of nowhere and there's not that many people that you interact with. So these granges would be places where there would be hoedowns and people could come together and hang out. But they eventually set up cost-cutting cooperatives, which is an organization to help share profits and costs, and eventually it lobbies for state regulation of railroads. Real talk, we have to talk about economics real quick, because we have to talk about what's called the gold standard. In 1873, the nation is put on what's called the gold standard. Now, the gold standard is basically the amount of money that you have and how much it's worth is determined by the amount of gold that is in the U.S. Treasury. So, if you have more gold in the U.S. Treasury, there's more paper money available. If you have less gold in the U.S. Treasury, there's less paper money available. Now, you might be thinking that you want more paper money available, right? Because that means more paper money means that more people have money. And farmers would agree with you. But here's the thing. The more paper money available, the less valuable it becomes. And I use the example of the first issue of Action Comics where Superman appears. How rare is that to find in mint condition? It's very rare. You don't find a lot of those. And so that's because the rarer it is, the more valuable it becomes. And we talked about Zimbabwe and how Zimbabwe was printing trillion-dollar bills and how they basically destroyed their economy by printing more money. Farmers want more money available so that way they can keep their prices high and get more money to them. So they advocate for what's called the free silver movement. And that basically means that not only is gold being used to determine how much paper money there is, now we add silver to the mix. That would lead to higher inflation. The rest of the country, especially manufacturing giants like John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, like we'll talk about, they don't want free silver. They want to keep stuff on the gold standard. And then we quickly brush through 3 presidents, James Garfield, Chester A. Arthur, and President Grover Cleveland. The only thing you really need to pay attention in this is that Grover Cleveland is the one that passes the Interstate Commerce Act, trying to regulate the railroads, but the railroads, they don't like to be regulated. Rise up, and they start what's called the Populist Party during President Benjamin Harrison's term. Political activism of farmers increases. And a populist, and we talked about what a populist is someone who believes that political philosophy should focus on the average person and not on just necessarily the wealthy. I hold up 2 candidates in particular that are considered populists by both the Republican and Democrat parties. Donald Trump is considered a populist candidate because many farmers support him as a candidate, whereas Bernie Sanders is also considered a populist candidate because in a lot of what he advocates for is for the average poor person. Unfortunately, the populists are not popular. They don't. In fact, they lose to Grover Cleveland, who becomes the only president to have 2 non-consecutive terms as president. And then in 1893, though, there's another panic. Remember last time we talked about the Panic of 1873. Now we're talking about the Panic of 1893. This helps strengthen the populist cause because there's a lot of people who just went poor all of a sudden, who lost a lot of their life savings. And then we get to probably one of the craziest elections in American history, the election of 1896. We have anti-silver and Republican William McKinley, who's technically a war hero from the Civil War, and a populist free silver Democratic candidate, William Jennings Bryan. Now, William Jennings Bryan is probably my favorite historical character in American history for a few different reasons. One is that he's the founder of our modern campaign election cycle. So today, in order to win the presidency, candidates have to go on a cross-country speaking tour. They have to kiss babies, shake hands with the average, everyday citizens. You know, they have to do things that show that they're a people's candidate. William Jennings Bryan founded that. Before this is typically how candidates would run for president. Step 1, stand on your porch. Step 2, deliver speech to people standing outside. Step 3, let the news carry that speech everywhere else. Step 4, attend a few parties, shake hands with people that are wealthy, and that will help fund your campaign. And repeat. But William Jennings Bryan, he doesn't do that. What he does is he goes on a cross-country speaking tour and gives thousands of speeches to average, everyday citizens. He shakes hands with everyone. In fact, he gives such a famous speech known as the Cross of Gold speech, where he basically says that without farmers, you cannot have anything. This is what William Jennings Bryan says in his Cross of Gold speech.
Burn down your cities and leave our farms, and your cities will spring up again as if it was magic. But destroy our farms, and the grass will grow on the streets of every city in the country.
So, who's going to win? A dude that just stood on his porch, or a dude that just went on a cross-country speaking tour and shook hands with average, everyday citizens? Well, as it turns out, money still determines the election, because William McKinley gets a lot of money for his campaign, and therefore William McKinley wins.
I make it rain on whoever. I make it rain at whoever. The blue devil. I got whoever. I make it rain on whoever. I make it rain at whoever. The blue devil. I got the.
He wins the Electoral College and the popular vote. However, though, a lot of the policies that the populists were arguing for are then soon picked up by both parties, both Republican and Democrat. And then the last thing that we talked about was as people began to move out west, eventually the land just kind of runs out. There's only so much land you can give away. And this means that white people who can't get land, they get very angry. Very angry. So the U.S. government opens up what was previously called Indian Territory to non-Native American settlers. This is considered probably the last place in America that's considered unsettled. However, Native Americans lived on that land, so it wasn't truly unsettled. And many Native Americans lost their land because people rushed into it and took it as theirs.
I claim this planet in the name of Ed!
So we talked about Frederick Jackson Turner and how his thesis isn't always exactly 100% accurate. In fact, much of it is not accurate at all. The West was not just a place for men. It was a place for many different cultures and many different people. And how it wasn't just a shining example of American individuality, how it was a place of American brutality oftentimes. That just about wraps it up for this content video. And then on Monday and Tuesday, we worked on a commercial for the Homestead Act, and I hope that you enjoyed this content video. Make sure you subscribe to this YouTube channel so that you don't forget any of the content videos. You can help study in the future and so on. But I'm going to bro fist it out. Stay safe out there, History Gang.